Hello, welcome to another episode for Covenant Theology, where I'm reviewing the different dispensations of dispensationalism as addressed by the book from Charles Ryrie called Dispensationalism. So in looking at this book, basically just picking apart the different ages and seeing kind of what covenant theology finds wrong with these different dispensations. So several videos on this now, looking at just how dispensationalism puts together their method of interpretation, their progressive revelation, and all these kinds of things. And now I've been digging through the actual ages or dispensations themselves. Just again showing where covenant theology has a different point of view, and there's not really a consistent method of interpretation going on, as we'll see in today's. So today's episode, looking at the age of the law, so the Mosaic law. It's a large age from a scripture standpoint. It absorbs most of the Bible because it, according to Charles Ryrie, starts about Exodus 19, where Moses starts receiving the law out Mount Sinai, and it runs, again, depending on your different dispensational franchise per se. It usually runs till John, the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 30, the death of Christ. But some dispensational circles extend the age not to just the death of Christ, but until the resurrection of Christ. Some say, well, that's when the age actually ends and the next age of grace starts. And then some others say, well, no, it's not until Pentecost that you actually have the age of grace start. So again, a little inconsistency within the different dispensational camps, a little infighting there. But again, you have to get with your elders, ministers, pastors, and see where your church lies on that. So what's the responsibility? So this huge age of Mosaic law, the age of law, dispensational law, is basically keep the law and walk with God, according to Charles Ryrie. That's the main responsibility for God's people in this age. Their failure, obviously, is through their idolatry that takes them into different and various captivities, the different ways in which they break the law, and obviously culminating in the New Testament, because this age encapsulates the Gospels, their ultimate rejection of Jesus. So, in their judgment, though, this age is a little different because its judgment is not really consistent with the prior ones. Yes, throughout this age, they go into captivity time and again under the book of Judges. They get ruled by different people and then are saved and then come out of it and then go back into another type of bondage and then come out of it. There's the Assyrian captivity, the Babylonian captivity, and obviously when the New Testament picks up, they're under Roman, in a sense, captivity. But yet, under all of these, there's not a cutting off, I guess you could say, like we saw with some of the other dispensations. They are instead said to be temporarily set aside. God will come back to them. So it's like, yeah, you failed this dispensation miserably, and all this stuff I've done working with you, it hasn't worked, and you've rejected my son now even too. So I'm not going to judge you the way I've judged you in other dispensations. I'm just going to stop working with you for a minute, and basically, I'm going to put you in a timeout. I'm going to deal with the Gentile world, and then I'm going to come back to you guys later. So totally different interpretational structure on the idea of judgment for this age. But so what's the critique here then? Well, I have basically about 8 points. So try to go through these quick. Try not to keep these lessons too long. But anyway, so first point, the law was never meant to be a separate dispensation. And I think if you've been following my videos at all, the responsibilities that Charles Ryrie assigns to the age makes that clear. If the responsibility is to keep the law and walk with God, that's what they've been required to do from the beginning. Again, this is not anything new. They're still under the same rules, I guess you could say, from God. Yeah, it's addressed differently because now instead of a individual or family structure, now as Moses with the whole people of Israel following him through the wilderness and into the promised land and even into and through captivities into the Gospels, it's more of a governmental structure because the number of people that we have. The national enlargement is, of course, brought in more rules as a people struggle and work to carry out the image of God. So the same thing in modern day church circles. The modern day church struggles to maintain its Christ-like identity, even with the simplistic rules that we're given for, worship, baptism, Lord's Supper. We have a lot less things to follow than the Old Testament church did, and yet we still struggle to maintain that image. So again, in covenant theology, we would see this administration of the covenant of grace still dealing with God's national people as a visible church type of distinction. We'd say dispensational wrongly treats this Mosaic covenant as a standalone test of obedience. No, rather, it's part of the unified story of God's redemption. He's bringing about his promised redemption through a child promised to Adam, through Noah, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, through the tribes, through David, and so forth, as prophesied and enlightened by the prophets, even in captivity, and then obviously revealed in the Gospels. That's the focus, not here's a test. Okay, so that's point 2 then. The law is not a test given, not for salvation and not for national righteousness. It has a purpose. What does the law do? It reveals sin, whether individually or nationally. How close is this entity or this individual measuring up with God's moral standard? And we would say, well, that reveals sin, because we don't. It's used to, another point of use of the law is that civil use to restrain evil. You do get a clear picture of whether someone's a believer or not. How do we restrain evil? Don't do this and do this. Do these things that reflect the person, work, and character of God, our Creator. Don't do these other things that go against those principles. And the ultimate purpose of the law then is not a test. It points to Christ. Everything in the law points to what he is, what he's going to do, his offices as prophet, priest, and king, and things like that. Again, same thing in the New Testament church. When you go to church and you see baptism and the Lord's Supper and preaching and the singing of psalms, all these things point to the person and work of Christ. They're not the things that you would look at and hopefully don't look at and say, because I do these things, I'm a Christian. Because I do these things, I'm part of the people of God. No, it's because God made you his people that you do these things to reflect and proclaim forth his work, his glory, his person, his character, his redemption. So again, not a test. It's not a failure. It's not a test to see whether they could achieve national righteousness. Because if they did and failed, well, this age in particular, in the age of the law, if you go through the laws of Moses, there are curses assigned. So you can't just say, well, we're just waiting on national Israel's fulfillment of the promises. No, they had that. They had the fulfillment of the promises. And now they've gone against his covenant and are experiencing the curses that Moses laid out. They are under the curses. They have been cut off. So what's the rebuttal then? Well, then here we would say the dispensational age, it focuses too much on this failure test concept. And that totally misrepresents the law's purpose. You should be able to look at the law and see an image of Christ and his work and his offices, not just national tests to maintain personal and national responsibilities. So which leads to the third point. So then Israel doesn't just fail a test. What are they doing throughout this age? Well, they're demonstrating universal sinfulness of humanity, of mankind's fallen estate. There's nothing unique about the failures in this dispensation in accordance with what we saw in Adam's failure, in the people around Noah, in Abraham and his families and what's going on, Isaac, Jacob, and all these things. There's sin run amok. So again, the judgment we see here is not like the other judgments, because if we look at, well, what would fulfillment of this test would have looked like? We've never gotten to the gospel. We would have never gotten to the atonement of Christ being on the cross and spread throughout the world. He would have never paid for sins with his death. They would have just accepted him and made him king. Like, no, there wouldn't have been acceptance of that, because even at a time where they did want to all of a sudden seize him and make him his king, he fled. He said, that's not the purpose. That's not why I'm here. So fourth rebuttal against this is that dispensationalism cuts too hard a line between the law and the gospel. These two things are not directly opposed to one another. The law and the gospel work together. The law drives people to Christ, and the gospel is a fulfillment of the law. If you can't see those interchanges and you just say law is done, grace is what we have now, and you just cut that down the middle and say never shall the two meet, then you've misrepresented Scripture. You do not understand law and gospel. You do not understand law and grace. Because especially in the New Testament, if you look at what's being argued about as Paul and others against the law, it's Jesus' stance in the gospel that the leaders have mistakenly taken the law to be their national system of righteousness. And Jesus says, no. If that's the way you're looking at it, dispensationalist, that's the way you're looking at it. If you're looking at it that way, you're wrong. It's never that. Never. And wasn't ever meant to be that. Paul, Jesus, they all agree. The arguments are that you're using the law incorrectly because they were supposed to point to Christ. These are the things that testify about me, Jesus says. So if you're cutting that distinction too sharply, law, gospel, law, grace, that doesn't do it for covenant theology. It's wrong. So fifth point then. So the Mosaic covenant was not a temporary dispensation. In the sense that what covenant theology looks at is, yes, you have the ceremonial aspects, and they've changed from all the different rituals that the Old Testament church had to what we now have in the New Testament church. We just have it simplified down to, the worship, preaching, prayer, discipline, and Lord's Supper and baptism. So those things are greatly simplified, but it's the same aspect of pointing to, like I said before, the person and work of Christ and the moral law, the moral character of God. No one is ever excused from that. Jew, Gentile, who have you. Everyone is responsible to live up to God's standard. And again, we don't do that. So it begs the question then, when the law hits someone that way, what must I then do to be saved? Oh, there's Christ who answers and fulfills that for us. The law doesn't provide that, but it points that direction. So then sixth point, then Christ was always at the center of the Mosaic covenant. And people say, no, the Mosaic covenant said, do this and live. Yes, but that's what rules always do. But that's just it. The law never stopped there under Moses. Look at everything else that follows. So do this and you live. But if you don't do this, here's the atonement, here's the sacrifices, here's the feast, here's everything else. Here's the entire priesthood is created to show the way that if you don't do this and so as to live, what do? You looked to Christ. You look outside of the law and say, oh my gosh, there's got to be somebody who fulfills this, someone who earns this, someone who does this on my behalf, or otherwise all these curses just fall on me or on us as a people. So the law has always had a schoolmaster, tutor perspective to it. Again, you send a teenager to school. Why? So they can be educated and yet fenced in a sense, to be guarded against just walking around the world all willy-nilly and just going, I don't know what to make of all this. No, let's train you up on all the hard principles of the world and how things work and what's going on, so you learn them. So when you are just released into the world, in a sense, what the New Testament does, it opens the gospel, it releases God's word into the world more directly. Been trained, God's people, the church has been trained on what to do with it. What does that look like? How to guard against things in the world, how to argue against things in the world, and stuff like that. So Christ should have always been the center of the Mosaic covenant at any point of law that we find, even under Noah, even under Abraham. The ram being provided for Abraham and the almost sacrificing of his son. God provides these things. So then point 7, this all leads us then into the New Testament concept that the church is not a plan B. That this was always meant to take place. God had always had the redemption of the world in scope. Israel under Abraham was told, you're to be a blessing unto the nations. This was always supposed to be an outworking and outflowing type of blessing that God's people carried with them, just like the church is God's people in the world and we're spreading the gospel outward. That was the intention of the Old Testament as well, but they never carried it out well. Sure, some people from the world grafted themselves, came into the Old Testament church, attached themselves to Israel at different points in time. But it wasn't like it is here now in the New Testament. So dispensationalism keeps focusing on, we failed this all law of age, and so God's going to move to the church instead. It's like, well, think about the way dispensationalism has characterized itself so far. If you're going to allow that God has transitioned from individuals to families to a nation, then why is it so hard that he would transition to the world? We've been constantly expanding, but then all of a sudden you get to this point of national to the world and you say, no. It's going to stay national. We're going to encapsulate the world as like a plan B. How is salvation a plan B? God's fulfillment of all these promises, plan B. No, if it's fulfillment, it's plan A. It's being carried out. Why restrict it to the world and then say, and then we're going to come back to this? I mean, we might as well say, well then, and we're going to come back to Noah, and we're going to come back to Abraham as a single family entity, as the people of God. That's inconsistent. It has clearly been moving individuals, families, national, world. But again, dispensationalism won't allow for that. They have to have you coming back to Israel for their, own agenda, I would say. But anyway, so that's one perspective. What about if you allow that within the end of the world under Noah, all those people were killed and only Noah was spared? And then through Abraham, you have Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael sent away. It only continues with Isaac. Jacob and Esau only continue with Jacob. Esau's out. These different groups that are from time to time cut off, we would say, from the promises. To what degree are they cut off and or permitted to come back in? As if they're all permitted to come back in, then again, we're all part of the promises. If you say, well, no, that's too open, it's got to be national Israel. You can't just keep opening it up to the people. Okay, well then if those people were truly cut off, Esau, Ishmael, and all them, and they don't belong to the promises anymore, well then guess what? In this dispensational age, when they refuse the Messiah, they are cut off. You say, well, no, the promises are to the Jews. Yeah, to the remnant. Who's the remnant? Well, guess what? The New Testament church was founded upon believing Jews who became that remnant and then took God's promises forward into the rest of the world. So either way, it's a losing proposition for dispensationalism, because you can't keep saying it's just this, but you exclude all these different variants. In other words, you end up not being able to explain anything that happened, because whichever trail you try to go ends up in one of these problems. Either everybody's included or almost nobody's included. And either way, that's too big of a shutout. So, sorry, checking my notes. Nationally. Yep. So the remnant, like I said, that would be left from the remnant to pass through the disciples then to the nations. That's the way covenant theology would see this. So to us in covenant theology, dispensationalism creates too much of an artificial gap here to say, oh, it's this mountain peak thing and God's going to move from here to here with his people, the Israelites, and yet we're now in this valley plan B of the Gentile church. It's like, that doesn't make any sense, and that's fabricated, that's imposed upon the text. The Bible does not actually, in a progressive revelation, read that way. It's a fulfillment of the promises already made to the people of the Jews in its New Testament construct that leads and goes out naturally to the rest of the world, to the Gentiles. It's organic in that sense. Last point, the Mosaic covenant didn't end because of Israel's rejection of Christ. So again, if you're reading this dispensationally, oh look, they rejected their Messiah, that ends the age. No, the Mosaic covenant ends, this administration of the covenant of grace in our perspective ends because Christ fulfills it. He said he's the fulfillment of the law. He says this. So this was planned from the beginning. This was mapped out to happen this way. Atonement would come. A child would eventually come and crush the work of the serpent under his feet for all time. And bring, the rest that's been expected for all this time. So Israel's rejection of Christ was known. Jesus talks about this himself. You've killed the prophets. Now I've sent my son, parable of the vineyard, and you've killed him too. Therefore, the kingdom's going to pass on to this remnant, these Jews that do believe in me, and it will continue from there. So dispensationalism ties the end of this age of law too much to an Israel-based failure of some standard rather than Christ's fulfillment of what he's always been talking about in the story of redemption. Within covenant theology, the golden thread I have under the logo over here somewhere, I'll post it in there. That golden thread, the story of redemption that goes beginning to end, it's one story. You don't chop it into all these little funny separate divisions. It doesn't work that way. That's inconsistent. You're looking at the discontinuity as many places as you can to try to squeeze in these other things, whereas you should be looking at the continuity, the continuation of God and his story in the sending of his son for redemption. And again, that naturally and scripture progressively reveals itself in God working from individuals to families to national to the world. And yet throughout that whole process, it's by faith, it's by grace, it's by God's mercy, and it's according to a gospel message that is supposed to be outflowing and outgoing everywhere we go. Be a blessing unto those who bless us, be a curse unto those who curse us, and so forth. So I'm at my time limit here. I don't want to keep this any longer. So God bless. Take care. May the peace and grace of Christ be with you all. And as always, leave a comment below, like, subscribe, share if you're so inclined. God bless. Bye-bye.